Boots crunched over the frozen gravel of Rotterdam's Pier E5, each step a fine, distinct grind. Lieutenant Robert James exhaled a brief plume of white that the North Sea wind shredded at once. It was a November morning in 1944, cold without mercy. Behind him came a 12-man U.S. Army engineer squad, each man silent under the weight of his kit, mine detectors, detonation cord, tool rolls, and the tight focus that only unknown explosives could demand. The orders had arrived the night before, clear and absolute. Conduct a systematic safety inspection and clearance of the Pier E5 sector of Rotterdam Harbor. The guiding principles were thoroughness and safety. They had 1 week to open a channel for the Neptune logistics convoy expected in early December. The word fast did not appear, but every line carried the front's hunger for supplies. James understood that hunger. He had just rotated out of France and had seen what shortages did. Still, his duty here was to resist that pressure and make the clearance complete, even if it took longer. The first lesson of professionalism was simple. Speed yielded to safety. The pier was a wreck, a retreating German scorched earth policy made visible. Cranes stood twisted. Steel cables drooped like dead snakes. Warehouse walls were pocked with bullet holes and widened blast scars. In the water lay sunken, unidentified obstructions. Yet, within the destruction there was an unsettling sense of order, the careful malice of German engineers. James's gaze snapped to a massive brick warehouse that looked almost intact, E5-7. It was too whole in a field of ruin. Instinct told him something was wrong. The initial external sweep confirmed it. The heavy steel doors were left slightly ajar, and at the hinge line a thin tripwire caught the light. The windows were boarded from inside, but through a loosened plank his flashlight picked out a web of steel wire and the faint outlines of explosive blocks. This was not random demolition, it was a designed death trap, a gift left for whoever tried to take the place too casually. "A classic farewell piece," said Sergeant Miller, the squad's seasoned NCO, crouched beside James. He had been burned by similar booby traps in Italy. "Inside will be layered. If the main structure goes, the blast and secondary effects could spread." His eyes lifted to the massive base of a harbor gantry crane about 30 yards away. The foundations looked separate, but underground conduits and cable bridges hinted at connections. It could drag that down, too. If the crane collapses, this deepest water berth is out of action. 2 weeks, minimum, to clear and recover. James nodded, silent. The professional assessment took shape fast. Option A, safety demolition. Use minimal external charges to induce detonation, or a controlled implosion to erase the warehouse and everything unknown inside. Fast. Relatively safe for engineers. Final. The cost, any usable supplies beneath the warehouse, however unlikely, would be destroyed. The shock could damage the nearby crane foundation and cripple the berth for an extended period. Option B, risk dismantlement. Send men in, map the trap system, and disarm it piece by piece. That would preserve port infrastructure and might save any supplies. The cost, long duration, extreme hazard. Every step could be a trigger, placing the whole squad under sustained lethal risk. James leaned toward option A. As commander, his first responsibility was his men and the military efficiency of the mission. Preserving the crane mattered, but throwing the squad into an obvious wolf's den did not fit any rational risk-benefit ratio. He was about to order detailed calculations for demolition parameters when a messenger ran up. "Lieutenant, someone's at the pier entrance. Says he's from City Hall and there's a priest. They insist on seeing whoever's in charge." James frowned. Civilians. In a war zone, civilians often meant unscheduled trouble. He signaled Miller to keep the perimeter sweep and isolation moving, then headed toward the entrance. 3 people waited there. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit with an ashen face who introduced himself as Van der Weer. an official from what remained of Rotterdam's municipal administration, a younger assistant with exhausted eyes, and an elderly priest in a worn black robe, cheeks hollowed by hardship. The wind shook them, but their eyes held a desperate urgency. "Lieutenant," Vanderweer said, his voice dry, "we'll be brief. We know you're clearing E5, especially Warehouse 7. We ask, no, we beg you, when you deal with it, be careful." "All clearance operations will follow professional procedure, sir," James replied. "We will ensure safety." "Safety?" The priest spoke suddenly hoarse. "Lieutenant, whose safety do you mean?" He stepped closer, cloudy eyes fixed on James. "Under that warehouse it is not munitions, not fuel, it is grain. About 300 tons of wheat and rye stored in a reinforced underground vault. It is the last of the pre-war municipal reserve. The Germans did not find it. We did not speak of it. We hoped, in the worst moment, it might hold us up." James froze. Grain. In the Western Netherlands in late 1944, the word carried crushing weight. He had heard briefings about the hunger winter, about German transport restrictions and food shortages, but those were numbers on paper and shaded regions on maps. Vanderweer's assistant, hands shaking, opened a battered folder and offered a page. It held handwritten tallies in rough script. Confirmed starvation deaths in central Rotterdam from late October to early November, 1,473. Estimated true number, 2,000 or more. Daily average, children's share. At the bottom, a crude curve rose steeply toward an unseen peak. 300 tons, rationed carefully, could keep 4,000 or 5,000 people alive through the coldest month, Vanderweer said, voice trembling. "That is thousands of lives, Lieutenant. If you blow it, it all becomes ash and char with the bombs." He pointed toward the warehouse. "We know it's dangerous. The Germans surely rigged it. We could not touch it, but you are experts. You may have a way to remove the bombs and save the vault beneath. Please, at least tell us if there is any chance." The wind lifted dust and slapped it against James's stiffened face. Minutes earlier, he had been thinking in terms of berth utilization and blast risk. Now a moral weight dropped into that framework. His orders were to eliminate threats and restore port function. They did not say to rescue an enemy nation's grain, and they did not require his soldiers to accept extra danger for it. His first response was pure procedure, even a little cold. "Gentlemen, my mission is military clearance. The explosives in that warehouse are a serious hazard and must be removed. My first responsibility is my soldiers and the military objective. The underground vault, if it exists, will be considered in the assessment, but I cannot promise anything. Grain is not within my tasking." The light in the priest's eyes dimmed. Vanderweer opened his mouth as if to argue, then released a thin, powerless breath. They looked colder, as though the chill now came from inside the bone. Watching them, James felt a sharp discomfort. Pure military logic suddenly seemed pale and sealed off. He hesitated, then offered what he judged to be the farthest compromise he could make without breaking bounds. "I will assign a more detailed technical survey focused on how an explosive event would affect the underground structure. If there is any structural possibility that the vault could survive after the primary hazard is cleared, we may have a chance to preserve part of it, but it will take time to assess. I can give you 24 hours starting tomorrow morning to organize a small group with the simplest tools to stand by outside the cordon. If the assessment is favorable and if the clearance proceeds without incident, there may be a very limited, very fast opportunity to move something. My work takes absolute priority. Your people do not interfere. Any risk is yours. That is all I can offer." It was not a promise. It was a procedural delay, a buffer to push an impossible dilemma forward by one day. Vanderweer and the priest exchanged a glance and nodded, gratitude threaded with uncertainty. They left with unsteady steps, their backs dissolving into the gray, hungry city beyond the port. James turned back toward the warehouse. His steps were heavier than before. Miller met him with new findings: a cleverly disguised ventilation opening at the warehouse's rear flank, possibly a path to the underground space, and just as likely a decoy or a booby-trapped entry. "What's your read, Lieutenant?" Miller asked. He had noticed the weight of the earlier conversation. "Build the demolition plan for the worst case," James said, voice returning to a controlled calm. "And I want you and 2 men to start a full structural map, inside and out, especially possible underground construction, and every connection point to the crane foundation. I want probabilities, as close to percentages as you can get." "For the grain?" Miller kept his voice low. James did not answer at once. He stared at the silent warehouse. Professional instinct still told him option A was the rational choice. Yet in the darkness beneath those bricks he imagined not a bomb's ticking, but the thin echo of hunger. He felt a hairline crack open in the boundary he had built around his role. "For a comprehensive assessment report, Sergeant," he said at last, as if convincing himself, "we account for variables, including any material that could have post-war recovery value. Now get to work. Time is not on anyone's side." Night fell early, Rotterdam's lights sparse and dim. Hunger moved through the city like a cold tide rising in silence. Around Pier E5, engineer lamps brightened and traced the outline of a race not yet begun. Steel and explosives on one side, time and conscience on the other. James knew his 24-hour compromise had only delayed the decision by a single day. The true pressure was gathering in the dark warehouse and the darker streets beyond. He woke the next morning with a faint unease. It did not come from fear of the warehouse traps, which were technical risks to be assessed and managed. It came from the 24-hour standby he had offered. It was a compromise inside a professional framework, a line meant to separate military orders from a humanitarian plea. But when he returned to the pier and saw a dozen municipal laborers, hollow-cheeked and under-equipped, huddled outside the cordon, waiting on a fragile hope, he realized that line was already failing. He ordered Miller to continue refining the survey, especially the underground vault's structural strength and the modeled effects of blast shock. He decided to go to City Hall himself, using coordination of potential transfer routes as the official reason. The reason sounded proper, but he knew the truth. He needed to see what the death statistics meant in flesh. The walk from the port into the battered city took minutes, but it felt like crossing into another dimension. The cold remained, but here it was joined by something deeper, a chill that lived under the skin. The streets were frighteningly empty. When pedestrians appeared, they wore ragged layers and moved with floating weakness, eyes either hollow or sharp with last resort tension. Shop windows were bare, boarded over. Walls carried expired notices and faded posters. A terrible quiet lay over everything. Even dogs were gone. City Hall was a sturdy old building, now more like a crowded shelter. The corridors were packed with women, children, and the elderly, wrapped in whatever they could find, pressed together for warmth, waiting for rations that might not come. The air was foul, thick with sickness, despair, and the faintest stench of waste. James's uniform stirred a ripple. Eyes turned toward him, and in those faces he saw thin hope, heavy suspicion, and deep numbness. He felt his throat tighten. He was an intruder from a world that still had food. Vanderweer received him in a bare office piled with files, his face hollowed by sleeplessness. "The numbers updated again, Lieutenant," he said without greeting, offering another sheet. "In the past 48 hours, even with what we can count." James did not take it. He raised a hand, signaling he needed air. He could not absorb more numbers. He left City Hall, heading back toward the port. The priest followed in silence a few paces behind. Neither spoke. At a street corner ahead, a small crowd gathered, voices low with muffled sobs and murmurs. James approached by instinct. The crowd parted for an American officer. Then he saw it. By a drainage ditch at the curb sat a woman curled inward. She was very young, perhaps not yet 20, wrapped in a tattered gray shawl. In her arms she held a small bundle of cloth, clutched tight. She did not move. Her eyes were open, fixed on the gray sky, but empty, as if her spirit had already stepped away. Her cheeks were sunken to a frightening degree, her lips cracked and purple. From the bundle, a corner showed the lifeless blue-gray face of an infant. An older woman tried gently to take the child from the mother's stiff arms, murmuring comfort no one believed in. A man beside her spoke softly to another. "She sat here all night. The baby died before dawn. She just holds him. No words, no crying. They say she has no family left. Her ration card went missing last week." Wind ran down the street, lifting scraps of paper and dust. James stood as if nailed to the pavement. The briefing numbers collapsed and reassembled as a single unbearable image. A mother holding her starved infant in a Rotterdam street in the winter of 1944, waiting for death to take her too. Supply calculations, engineering probabilities, orders and compromise all became thin and distant in the face of that scene. War had many ways to kill, but hunger was the slowest and the most universal. It did not care about uniforms. The priest's voice reached him, quiet but heavy. "God has closed his eyes, Lieutenant. Now there is only man." James turned sharply and left, almost at a jog, escaping that street, that crowd, that mother's vacant gaze. The wind cut his face until it burned. He did not look back until the massive silhouette of warehouse E5-7 rose again at the pier. Miller met him, holding fresh structural sketches, and began his report. "Lieutenant, preliminary modeling shows that even minimal directional demolition gives more than a 70% probability of damaging the vault roof. Shock transmission through the foundation also risks the crane base. Structural cracking is possible, and the repair timeline would be longer than we estimated. If we attempt layered microcharges, we might reduce damage, but time and technical demands—" "Enough," James cut in, voice rough. He stared at the warehouse as if he could see through brick into the darkness below, to 300 tons of grain, and then beyond to the infant's face. The images overlapped, refusing to separate. Standard procedure would clear the hazard and turn the grain to ash, and it might still cost the birthdays if the crane base cracked. War would continue, and the order would be fulfilled. But the mother in the street and thousands like her would keep vanishing. "Option B," James said. Each word felt forced out of his chest. "Controlled dismantlement. Preserve the underground vault and the crane. I need a new plan, detailed step by step, and a technical assessment that can get higher command to approve it." Miller blinked. "Lieutenant, that means we go in and sit with those traps for days, maybe longer. The risk—" "I know the risk," James snapped, then lowered his voice, glancing at the soldiers nearby who waited for direction. "I know, but there's another risk we have to calculate. If we choose the safer option, and it wipes out the last hope for thousands, what do we do with that later? Engineers don't just remove obstacles. We pave the way for what comes after. What comes after is not only convoys and cargo." He steadied his tone back into command. "Sergeant Miller, execute. I want a preliminary dismantlement route map and a risk table by tonight. Cancel the original 24-hour standby. Tell City Hall the plan has changed. Have their people withdraw, but keep a line open." For the next hours, James shut himself inside the temporary command post. Maps and survey notes spread before him beside blank paper. What he had to produce was not a plea soaked in emotion. It had to be a weapon forged from pure, unarguable military logic. He had to forget grain, forget hunger, forget the mother. On the page, there could be only steel, concrete, berth utilization, tonnage schedules. He drafted a new assessment. The title was Clinical, Final Recommendation on the Neutralization of Threats in Pier E5, Warehouse 7, and the resulting impact on port operational efficiency. The opening laid out the warehouse's explosive complexity and high hazard, and the two options: A, full demolition; B, controlled dismantlement. Then he devoted pages to the severe secondary damage risk of option A, focusing on the high probability impact on the adjacent gantry crane foundation. He cited engineer manual figures and calculated that the minimum timeline for foundation repair, crane recovery, and berth dredging was 18 to 24 working days. He carried that into the projected disruption to Neptune and follow-on convoy scheduling. The tonnage delayed the drag-on frontline resupply tempo. He even accounted for winter weather extending the work. Then he turned to option B. He acknowledged higher personnel hazard and time uncertainty, then emphasized that the approach would preserve critical port infrastructure and remove long-term operational liability. He framed the dismantlement as an extremely complex but tactically valuable engineer challenge, estimated at 5 to 7 continuous working days, backed by a rotation plan, protective measures, and emergency medical contingencies to show risk had been maximally controlled. The conclusion was blunt. For long-term logistics efficiency, option B produced higher strategic value than option A and should be approved. He signed his name and rank. The document was cold, precise, and entirely within military logic. It did not mention grain, but every line existed to give that grain a chance to live. The report went by courier to battalion headquarters. The wait was long. James stepped outside into the night. The pier lights and the city's deep darkness formed a harsh border. He remembered the priest's words, "Only man." In that moment, he chose to believe that professional skill could become a kind of mercy. Approval returned before midnight, unexpectedly fast. Battalion's order was brief. Based on your unit's professional assessment, option B's risk is controllable and its long-term logistics benefit is significant. Approved for execution. Your unit bears full responsibility for operational safety and subsequent port functional status. End. No praise, no extra words. Only approved and full responsibility. It was enough. A license purchased with military logic and paid for in risk. When the order arrived, the squad had just finished a night reconnaissance and gathered in their rough quarters. James assembled them. A dozen faces looked up at him in weak light. Technicians, demolitions men, diggers, radio operators. They were professionals, not saints. "Mission update," James said. "Her higher command approved controlled dismantlement. We're not demolishing. We're going in and taking it apart by hand, one piece at a time. 5 to 7 days, maybe longer. The reason is simple. Demolition would damage that gantry crane and shut this best berth down for at least 3 weeks. That slows every crate of ammunition, every drum of fuel, every ration headed to the front. Our job is to keep the lane open, not create a new bottleneck." He paused, scanning the faces. "I know this is more dangerous. It's layered, unknown traps. Could be Zoo 35, could be something else designed to kill us. Every step can go wrong, but that's why we're trained. This is the kind of job that belongs in an engineer manual. We're not just clearing an obstacle. We're protecting the lifeline for every unit that comes after. That is what we do." He did not mention grain. He appealed to professional pride, responsibility to other soldiers, and the challenge of difficult technical work. It was enough. No one cheered, but the air thickened into a steadier resolve. Miller spoke first. "Should have been the plan from the start, Lieutenant. Demolition is the lazy way." Others nodded and murmured technical questions. Hands moved to check gear with sharper care. They accepted the reason because it fit who they were. When the men dispersed for final preparation, James walked alone beneath the warehouse's immense shadow. In the direction of the city lay deep darkness with a few weak pinpricks of light, like embers about to die. Inside the warehouse was engineered death. Beneath it, a thin chance at life. He had just used a rigorous report and a professional briefing to place himself and his men on the narrowest wire between the two. Night wind carried salt from the North Sea and dust from ruin. He lifted his head and saw no stars. It was a gamble with professional skill as the only stake. On one side were his soldiers' lives and careers. On the other were thousands of strangers' tomorrows. Retreat had vanished the moment he chose. Now there was only execution, days of precision work on the edge of a blade, with no room for error. Before dawn, on the fifth day, the darkest hour of the morning, the area around warehouse E5-7 had been transformed into an operating theater. Floodlights from multiple angles washed the walls bright and erased shadows that could hide visual traps. The squad divided into two teams, each man in heavy blast protection that made them look like silent, clumsy astronauts. James wore partial armor himself. As commander, he should have stayed at the perimeter, but he insisted on entering the inner cordon for the first, most dangerous phase. Some pressure had to be shared. There was no dramatic opening. The dismantlement began with the dullest, most careful work. Miller led the first team using extended non-metal probes and specialized small cutters at the ventilation opening that had been checked again and again. Inch by inch, they cleared debris and widened the entry. Every stone removed, every wire cut was inspected for hidden linkage to a firing chain. Progress was measured in centimeters. Sweat formed inside the protective suits, turned cold against the skin, then warmed again under sustained concentration. Time stopped behaving like time. There was only breathing, the scrape of tools, and short, precise reports. Left side cleared, no anomaly. Fiber line located, isolated, awaiting classification. The first operational day ended in forced suspension late that afternoon. When the opening was just large enough for one man to crawl through, a forward camera feed showed the interior bomb array was more complex than expected and chained to multiple decoy trigger devices. Small charges placed to be obvious and easy to trip, designed to lure a dismantler into the first fatal mistake or to force abandonment of careful work in favor of brute force. It was a psychological ambush as much as a technical one. James called a stop. Everyone withdrew. In the makeshift shelter, they chewed hard biscuits and drank cold water over the rough interior sketches they had drawn from the feed. Frustration settled, not because anyone was hurt, but because they were falling behind even the most conservative schedule. "They don't want us to dismantle," muttered Calvin, the young demolition specialist. "They want us to leave or blow up with it." James stared at the sketches, refusing to indulge the mood. He pointed to the decoy placements. "Look at the layout, concentrated on the east beam and the north wall. It's like an active defense gate. If we can neutralize or bypass this layer safely, the core may be more standard. German engineers are still men. Their time and explosives weren't infinite. It might be bluff, but we treat it as real." He adjusted the plan. Instead of entering directly to reach the main array, they would cut 3 narrow access holes through selected points in the outer wall, openings only wide enough for an arm and tools. From outside, they would isolate and remove the decoys. It meant more drilling and cutting, but it reduced exposure to the unpredictable interior. The second operational day began with the low growl of the drill. The sound was not loud, but every vibration tightened nerves, each man wondering whether resonance might trigger something unseen. 3 holes took the entire morning to complete safely. Then came finer work. Through the holes they inserted tools fitted with microlights and mirrored observation heads like remote surgical instruments, isolating and dismantling the decoys without direct entry. The task fell to Miller and Calvin, alternating to keep hands steady. James watched on a monitor. Each tiny movement felt as if it pulled at his heart. Around 3 in the afternoon, the first decoy was rendered safe, its igniter removed. When the small, malignant metal block was eased out through the hole, the squad released a short breath. It was swallowed immediately by the next problem. Professionalism became something close to meditation. Fear shut outside the mind so that the entire self could focus on one circuit, one wire, one mechanism. By dusk, the final decoy was neutralized. The active defense gate inside the warehouse had been lifted without a sound. Fatigue peaked. James ordered a 4-hour rest and mandatory sleep. No one slept deeply, but closed eyes restored a sliver of strength. At midnight they assembled again. The floodlights made that patch of pier a bright island against the dark city and darker river. Now they could finally face the core bomb array. The third operational day was the last acceptable margin. Intelligence suggested the Neptune convoy's lead ships could reach the outer approaches within 48 hours. Time tightened like a noose. The core dismantlement required James and Miller to enter the warehouse themselves. In full protective gear, they moved through the widened entry into a space thick with dust, mildew, and the faint chemical odor of explosives. Along the main beam, a line of German explosive blocks was tied into a complex network of wires and pull fuses. At its center was a Zu-35 anti-handling device, the infamous devil's egg. Any attempt to cut primary lines or shift the charge could trigger its balance mechanism and cause instant detonation. Every motion had been rehearsed dozens of times. They communicated with gestures and the smallest words. Outside, their comrades adjusted lighting angles on command to avoid shadows that could ruin judgment. James stabilized the explosive blocks and key load-bearing elements. Miller, with hands made for mine work, dealt with the Zu-35. Minutes bled into one another. Breath fogged inside the face shields and cleared. Outside, the waiting soldiers saw only 2 near-frozen figures in hard light and the slowest glint of a tooltip moving by fractions. At about 10 in the morning, the unexpected happened. As Miller reached for the final isolation step, a steel beam that had not been flagged, slightly warped by building settlement, gave a faint creak. A loose flake of brick dropped from above. Every heart stopped for a beat. Miller's hand froze, unmoving. James immediately raised a prepared support pole and braced the threatened area with motion as gentle as touching a soap bubble. The brick flake landed on the floor a few centimeters from the firing network. Dust drifted downward. After a long stretch of seconds with no chain reaction, Miller released a slow breath and continued. In that moment, everyone understood that walking on thin ice was not a metaphor. At noon, sunlight briefly punched through the clouds and threw a few pale patches onto the warehouse floor. Miller completed the final manipulation, then withdrew his fingers in a slow, controlled retreat until they were fully clear. He turned to James and nodded through the visor. Core neutralized. There was no cheering, no embrace. The 2 men backed out step by step and emerged into open air. The soldiers waiting outside stood straighter, eyes meeting in a quiet exchange of relief and deep exhaustion. James removed his helmet. Cold air hit his face and made him shiver. Sweat and dust streaked his skin. The remaining work was more routine, removing now safe explosive blocks, checking for hidden secondary fuses, and assessing structural stability. That took most of the afternoon. When the last crate of removed explosives was hauled away for controlled disposal, the sky was already turning toward evening. The warehouse stood empty and quiet, dust drifting through slanted light. The entrance to the underground vault was located and opened. Inside, stacked sacks were faintly visible. By radio, James sent battalion a short coded phrase: "Surgery complete, patient stable." The reply came quickly: approved for scheduled equipment inventory and transfer. It was permission wrapped in shared understanding. After nightfall, City Hall's trucks rolled quietly onto the pier. No lights, only low voices and the dull thumps of loading. James's squad held the perimeter, backs to the warehouse, faces toward the dark city and the river beyond. They heard sacks dragged and stacked, heard Vanderweer's restrained urgent directions, but none of them turned around. That was part of the arrangement. They had completed a military mission. Equipment inventory and transfer belonged to a parallel world. Some victories could exist only under a code of silence. When the last truck left, the pier returned to stillness. James stepped alone into the empty warehouse. The vault door stood open, the space inside now bare. 300 tons of grain were gone to where they needed to be. He stood for a moment, then turned away and locked the warehouse doors. Outside, the great gantry crane rose intact in the night. The next morning, James's final report went to battalion. The main body was 3 lines: threats in Pier E5, Warehouse 7 neutralized, all explosives disposed, keyport infrastructure, including the gantry crane, inspected and found intact, berth immediately operational, clearance complete. The attachments were thick, technical logs and itemized disposal lists, cold and exact, about grain, hunger, the days of strain and choice. There was not one word. The report was signed, received, filed, and became another ordinary document among thousands. James's name would not appear on any commendation list. Neither would his men's. Their achievement would be defined as having performed engineer duties. Days later, in Rotterdam, municipal authorities, under tight security, began distributing the recovered grain. Lines were long and silent. People clutched thin ration cards, and in some eyes a small light returned. Near one distribution point, James, now in civilian clothes, paused at a corner. He watched an old woman receive a small sack of rye flour and press it to her cheek with shaking hands. He watched a father split a hard loaf and push pieces into his 2 children's mouths with urgent speed. Grain could not revive the dead, but it could slow death's advance and buy the living a little room to breathe. He turned away without speaking to anyone. Back at the temporary quarters, he opened his footlocker and slid his report copy beneath a stack of old maps. The box held his drafting tools, a worn engineer manual, and insignia from different theaters. The report would fade and be forgotten like the rest. But he knew that in that cold, desperate winter of 1944 in Rotterdam, something had shifted because a group of American engineers chose a harder, riskier path. The harbor crane would keep lifting the machinery of war. And the city, because of that choice, would allow some people to see the next spring.